Kia ora mai tātou. E tua ki tēnei ki te mihi atu kia koutou ai tēnei ata makariri. Engari kia koe mo te mihi mahana tēnei ata tēnā koe o tira kia koutou katoa ngā mihi nui. I want to acknowledge the traditional landowners whose land we stand on and whose people support us to be here and look after us while we're here. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Right. I'm going to put up a couple of images just to start off for you to get to know me. So I'm a mother, first off. This is my one and only. She's 8 years old and she's very disappointed not to be here. I can tell her she was. She likes the hat. This is another part of my life, so I'm engaged in this, which is one of our traditional sports. We call it waka ama. Other people know of it as outrigger canoeing. It was kind of an interesting picture to put up in terms of, to make an analogy, I guess, around leadership and around mentoring, which is part of what leadership is really, in my view. So that's me in the back, and I'm steering the waka really well around that buoy. For people who have ever done outrigger canoeing, to get that close in and whip round the corner is pretty munty. And anyway, but what I wanted to say was that that leadership happens from the back in many respects when you're paddling an outrigger canoe. That's the person that's directing where you're going, not in fact the person who's sitting at the front. But it's not all about me sitting at the back there, it's also about the person sitting at the front whose key role it is to set the pace. So the back person's setting the direction and the front person's setting the pace. And everyone in between us is making sure that we're going there together. And if we get out of time and we get out of sync, we're not going to get anywhere fast. So that's the reason that one's there. So just think about that in terms of mentoring. Why did I put the picture of the garden there? Oh, it's just another part of my life. Like I say, I wanted you to get to know me through the pictures, but also to be saying that as Indigenous researchers, one of the things that we're cognizant of, I think, and other people have certainly reflected it in their talks, is the need to be whole and rounded people, and that's what being healthy Indigenous people's about. And growing our own food and knowing that it's not full of chemicals and other crap is an important part of our health and well-being. The other slide that I took out this morning, but I do want to just mention really briefly that today's an important day in our country, and it's an important day for the people of Tāmaki Makaurau, which is the proper term or name for the city of Auckland. And it's an important day because 35 years ago today, it's the anniversary in fact today, the 35th one of the time where the people of Ngāti Whātua, the tangata whenua of Auckland City, were forcibly removed from their lands. They sat in occupation for 507 days on their land, and the result of that, finally, last year I think it was, that they reached a treaty settlement with the Crown and had some of that land returned and some financial compensation. So it's an important day, and I just want to acknowledge that. And I acknowledge that because another important point about being an Indigenous researcher of excellence is to remain connected and to remain politically active and to remain and be really conscious, I think, of the political context in which our research exists and how it contributes to that. But these are the things that I'm going to talk about. One of my roles, I lecture, I research in Māori education, I lecture and I research in Māori health, and I also direct postgraduate studies in our school and run this mentoring program known as MAI. Māori and Indigenous doctoral program at the university. Those are the things that we'll cover. So, I forgot about my notes. Clarifying the foundation slide. So I popped these up because I think these for me are some reflective questions that I think are really critical for us to answer clearly first, or as at least we set out on developing an Indigenous mentoring program. I think in terms of the last question, we need to be really clear and remind ourselves perhaps that we have a vast wealth of traditional knowledge. We have, and Cheryl alluded yesterday to one of the, or to two of the concepts actually, and I'll talk slightly about those in a second. Two of our concepts that come from our tupuna, from our ancestors, that tell us we've been doing mentoring for a long time. We have particular ways as Indigenous peoples of doing that, and I think that's where we're to look at in terms of designing something for ourselves now. And one of the concepts that was mentioned yesterday was a concept called tuakana taina, and really it's about the reciprocity of teaching and of learning. It's about those relationships of leadership but also of followership, and that there's a fluidity within this concept of tuakana taina. And yesterday a couple of other people were talking about that issue of perhaps supervising or mentoring somebody who's much older than yourself, and the way that there can be some sense of fluidity really in terms of the times when, yeah, sure, you're sitting there as the expert in terms of supervising the person through their thesis, but at other times you might sit there as the learner, and that's what tuakana taina is about. And it's about knowing. I mean, the wisdom is in knowing when to change yourself from that seat of teacher to that seat of learner, and being at ease with that, being able to move between the two. And that to me is your level of expertise as a mentor, knowing when you're there to learn actually as well as to teach. Gender-specific mentoring. Let me think, what was I going to say there? Okay, really, let me make it up. No. I know I put it there for a purpose. No, I think another thing that came up yesterday, and that's when I added this bullet point in, was that issue of the particular needs perhaps of women who are parenting, and I know that men parent as well, but women who are parenting, perhaps raising their children on their own, so having to be the breadwinners in the family, as well as do their PhD and things like that. So there is some need to be cognizant, I think, of gender-specific mentoring, the particular needs of both men and women, and how those are similar at some times and different at other times. As Indigenous peoples, I think being aware that we've gone through different types of oppression as men and as women, that the colonisers of our countries taught us things, taught us ways to behave that were different to our own as men and as women. And I think part of our decolonising process, and for me that is part of any mentoring program for Indigenous peoples, part of our decolonising process is to understand those differences and to meet our specific needs along the way. Was that a good make-up? No. Okay. So if we're talking about developing a mentoring program for Indigenous peoples that is aimed ultimately at building our capacity to be researchers of excellence, we need to have a really clear understanding as well as what Māori or Indigenous academic excellence looks like, and how that's the same as well as how that's different to other research excellence, other ways that we conceptualise research excellence. And in our My program, these are some of the things that we talk about and that we try and foster. It's about things like telling it how it is, telling Indigenous truths, and dispelling some of those colonial myths. And to get a greater understanding of that, I think you couldn't go in any better direction than Decolonising Methodologies by Linda Smith. So I won't go into it further because we haven't got time. But really it's in our mentoring program for doctoral candidates, we talk a lot about the importance of being grounded as an Indigenous academic and how that is different to just being grounded as an academic. That it's about us creating the spaces and supporting our doctoral candidates in this case to be able to be excellent academics as Māori. That the two things are not separate, that in fact they fit really well together, and we know that because we've got models from our ancestors, and Emma talked about that yesterday. We've got some really good models of Māori and of other Indigenous peoples who have for a long time been able to be very Māori or very Indigenous as well as being very academic. So it's not new. So I thought I'd tell you really quickly what My does do, and there it is. Really important to acknowledge creating Indigenous spaces within the Academy, and I think what we're here at this meeting talking about is creating Indigenous spaces that are really strong and supportive both academically, politically and culturally. One of the only other bullet point that I want to speak to in terms of what the My program is about is that it requires an understanding on behalf of the doctoral students who attend, both of the privilege to be in the area of scholarship that they're working in, but also knowing that that's a right. Also knowing that with that right and with that privilege to be undertaking the kind of research that our students are, come obligations and come accountability. And the greatest accountability in our eyes, and this is what we talk with people about, is to make sure that at the end of the day, that big fat book that you produce has some real meaning and is actually going to create some change. What we don't do, and these are perhaps good messages for us to think about in terms of what we're developing, we don't want to replicate what's already provided within the Academy or within the research context. Neither do we want to take responsibility for creating something that should be being provided for elsewhere in the Academy or elsewhere in the research context. I won't talk to the other points, I just want to make sure that I get through. There's only a couple more. In terms of challenges and opportunities, maintaining Indigenous values in institutions and in research contexts that devalue, in fact, our ways of being. That's a challenge, it's also an opportunity. Ensuring that our research is transformative, that it makes meaningful change. I think one of the other points that I hope Clive will speak to later on this morning is it's both a challenge and an opportunity to look at how it is that Indigenous peoples, we work together, and I was involved in one of the first Iki Hurt projects, and I think one of my greatest learnings was not to assume that as Indigenous peoples we necessarily have a really easy fit. That there are some things that we kind of intrinsically know will be similar, but there were many more things that I discovered that were quite different about us, and the biggest perhaps underlying element of that was our different political contexts, both contemporary and historically, and how that impacted, in fact, on how we express our indigeneity through our research. So I do think that's a challenge. Okay, just going to end on a couple of quotes, and this one comes from one of our academics who maintains activism as well through her work. And what she said last year at a conference I was at was, it's just not enough to intellectualise, we must inspire. To inspire is what creates meaningful change. So for me, these are some of the understandings that I wanted to share. I think they're really critical indicators of what being a Māori or Indigenous scholar of excellence is. That's the end, yeah. Kia ora mai koutou, ngā mihi.
Look, I'm a bit like Carrie yesterday. I'm very privileged to even be in this room, let alone have an opportunity to tell my story to people like yourselves. So, yeah, I feel like a bit of a groupie as well. I must acknowledge that I'm not from this country. I identify as an Aboriginal and South Sea Islander Australian, and my mob are Mananjali from Beaudesert, which is in southeast Queensland. I wasn't born and raised on country. I was born and raised on Yagara country in Brisbane, on the outer southern suburbs. I'm a product of what is deemed a mixed marriage. So my mother is white and she has English and Irish heritage, and I think 6th or 7th generation. My father is an Aboriginal Islander man, and this year I think we mark the 150th anniversary of South Sea Islander labour in this country. So for those who are unaware, we had people brought from various islands in the South Pacific, Solomon, Fiji, Vanuatu, who were used as slave labour in the east coast of Queensland. One of the first shipments came to Beaudesert, and we believe that's where my great-grandmother met my great-grandfather, and they travelled and left Beaudesert and worked around northern New South Wales as well as along the north coast of Queensland. So my mob spread from Bowen in North Queensland down to around Byron Bay in northern New South Wales. There's an awesome beach called Wattigos Beach, which is my mob's name. So Bond is my married name, Wattigo is my family name. Professionally, I'm an Aboriginal health worker and I'm a researcher, and I work at the University of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit. I just commenced in that position this year, and for the 5 years prior to that, I've been working at Inala Indigenous Health Service in various roles. I still maintain a relationship with Inala, so I work 1 day a week at the health service, which I really enjoy. Personally, I'm a married mum of 5 children. In my spare time, I'm involved in running a community development organisation in the community that is home for me and my family, and that is Inala. For those who aren't aware, Inala is on the outer southwest suburb of Brisbane, and it has traditionally been home to the largest Indigenous population in the Brisbane area. So it's a very strong, proud community. So my connections are really as an urban Indigenous person, and working with people who come from other places but also have a strong connection to place in a different place that wasn't traditionally their place. So it's a bit of that story that I tell today as well. I am also the youngest of 4 children, and like many of you here, I'm first in family, first generation university student. So I'm going to tell a bit about my journey and how I became a researcher and what the specific things that were really valuable for me. But I start off with this photo, and I like this photo for a whole range of reasons. One is that I got a university medal for my honours, so I was I like that. So I got a big note just for a moment. But I also like the photo. It's a photo that includes my father, who is now passed away. So it's one of the few photos that I have of us together, which I really value. And what I like most about this photo that is you see my parents here peering over this little gold thing that I got at some university. And Mum and Dad knew it was a special occasion. Mum actually sewed her new outfit and sewed Dad a flash vest as well. So it was a special occasion in our family. But it was kind of like we were strangers who had infiltrated this sacred space that we didn't necessarily belong to. And so there was this unease, and they'd come along to a few different ceremonies over the years, but they kind of stood in the corner and we kind of just stood there nervously and went through the process, and it was just very strange. It was a very curious kind of space. So I guess when we're talking about Indigenous health researchers, it's remembering who we are, where we come from, and that we're still coming from a place where this is very foreign for us, and that this investment needs to be a bit more intense given that history, that context. Yesterday people talked about being accidentally getting into research, and I accidentally got into university. I was one of these kids who was smart early on in school, but in my senior years got into a fair bit of mischief and didn't go to school a lot. And it just so happened that when I was in grade 10, I picked subjects that required me to fill out a QTAC form because I had OP relevant subjects. So basically I was meant to at least put an application in for university because of the subjects I studied at high school. And when the guidance officer asked me what I wanted to do, I just said I want to work with my people. And there happened to be a degree at the University of Queensland in Indigenous health, and I went from being a student who was failing in grade 12 to a straight 7s in first semester at university. Because I found my thing. So I didn't have any aspirations, though, to be a health researcher. And I became a health researcher, not accidentally, though. I fell into university accidentally, but I became a health researcher because of two things. It was about investment and intention. And there were people that had an intention for me and an investment in me for me to be a health researcher. That wasn't accidental, and I want to talk about what those were. And the intention wasn't for my parents. My intention for my parents, we grew up working poor. The intention of my parents was to go to high school, and if I finished in grade 10, get a job. And most of my siblings worked part-time, went to high school, and ended up going full-time as a checkout chick in the part-time job they were doing during high school. And that was what the expectation for me was. And there was much pride in being a hard worker. There was no shame in that. So my parents' intent was to always hold my head up high and to work hard, but it wasn't to be a researcher. There were quite a number of people who had the intent for me to go much further. And so one of the lessons we've learned, and certainly my role working with the University of Queensland, is we actually have what we call faculty working parties. So I have, each member of our unit meets with all the faculties across the university, and we case manage all Indigenous students across the university. So I'm the link person for all Faculty of Health Science subjects, and I meet with the heads of schools 4 times a year to review the performance of our Indigenous students, to make sure they know who their Indigenous students are, because often they don't, and we have to remind them. And it's not about crisis management. It's not about going, how do we make sure these kids pass? It's let's look at all of our kids coming through university, and let's look at how we help them to be better, whether they're sitting on a 4 or a 5 or a 6. And it's identifying those students who are demonstrating excellence early on and nurturing them early on. So investing early, identifying these people very early. So first year, if we've got some students coming through on 6s and 7s, then we need to go, well, how do we start planting that seed around research? Once we identify these students, what we need to do is exposure. So for me, I got lots of opportunities as an undergraduate working as a research assistant in really fun, safe kinds of ways. So I learnt that there was a career as doing research and being a researcher, and there's a whole culture and a whole language around research that was foreign to me. And so throughout my undergrad degree, I was given exposure to what it meant to be a researcher. And in university world, we talk about aspiration building for Indigenous kids coming to university. So we talk about, getting them in grade 7 and talking about university. It's the same thing for developing researchers. We need to be, as soon as they come in our door, we need to be talking to them about research pathways and what it means to be a researcher. So that aspiration building within university as well. Investment. For me, the big thing has been that people have invested and invested time in me. So most of my early, the people who invested in me early on were not necessarily Indigenous people. They were non-Indigenous lecturers who saw something in me and gave their time. So I think it's important to recognise that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have a role in developing Indigenous health research capacity and mentorship. And I was fortunate to find people that I could trust. I trusted their agenda, I trusted them, and they trusted me to not, they knew what what they were giving to me and what I was giving to them. And so the whole issue is about reading identity and authenticity. I couldn't engage with people who were invested in that kind of practice, so I had to find out which non-Indigenous mentors were useful for me and who I could trust. But it's about investing that time and knowing that we sometimes have to invest a bit more time. And I've had former lecturers who have followed up with me after finishing and being out in the workforce and checking in. So it's that constant maintaining that relationship with our Indigenous students. Entice. So, you know, the pool of Indigenous people with degrees is still quite small, so we know that the competition is fierce for our graduates of university. The things that enticed me, I was fortunate enough when I did my PhD, I got an APA scholarship, but I also got some top-up money from the Cooperative Research Centre for Aboriginal Health, which topped it up to a level at which I think medical PhD students get paid, so it was at a higher rate. So I think we need to offer additional investments to entice Indigenous people into research higher degrees. We know that there are a lot of mature age entry students and that they have mortgages and children to raise, and taking 3 years out of their working life to do a PhD is quite hard. So what are the flexible options we have for part-time study so that people can still stay in the workforce, as well as the scholarships? How can we manage around scholarships that require people not to work but knowing full well that they need to work and that they're supporting their families? For me, this is I'll see if I can zoom in here. This is my 5 children. I should put there's the husband and the 5 children. Thank you. So I actually had 3 children during the course of my PhD, one just before, one in the middle of field work and one at right up stage. I finished in under 4 years, and I got in the top 10% of the graduating year. Thank you. But it worked for me. I knew that I was at an age where I wanted to have children, and this was a flexible option for me. I was doing it in my own community, so it was stuff that I loved doing. And it worked because doing 9 to 5 work and raising kids is actually a lot harder than doing a PhD where you can sit in your pyjamas and, you know, type, or feed a baby and type in the middle of the night. You know, it actually worked. So I think it's thinking about flexible options for Indigenous research high degree students. I've got up here a stream because we talk about the pipeline a lot in university around, you know, building the pipeline, and I think for research development and mentoring, it's really about the different streams and seeing people are at different spaces and occupying different spaces as researchers. So it's thinking that it's not just about the university pipeline, it's about people working in health services sector, community controlled, in all the different spaces that Indigenous people are working, and how do we connect and build in. And I guess like Sandra had said yesterday, it's not just about the emerging researchers, it's about researchers at all levels of their career. Engage. So I think it was Cheryl yesterday talked about, you know, getting into the community. And so as an Indigenous person in Inala, it's very isolating having done a PhD because there's no one I can talk to who's done the same thing. But getting into the Indigenous academic community is something that is really important. And I put 2 people here that have been really instrumental in both my undergrad and postgrad career. Noel, of course, have created pathways for me. And I guess what I really value is that I know I'm a first generation or first timer with university, but there are people that have gone before me who have been first time at everything, you know, the first person to open the door into particular spaces. And what I really, really value is that these people have left the door open for us to come through as well. And I understand and appreciate that there are people that have gone before us that have had no one holding the door open for them. And so we're in a very privileged place to have people like Noel and Sandra and Cindy holding that door open for us to come through, and I think that's really important. So a couple of things that got me into the community in terms of an academic community. The Medical Journal of Australia have this awesome competition every year. It's an essay writing competition, the Dr. Ross Ingram Memorial Essay, and anyone working in Indigenous health can write this essay and you can win $5,000. I've had a couple of cracks and I've never won it, and but I've got my articles published, and one of the first articles I got published, I've got, you know, pretty good citation rating from it. I've had students approach me for supervision as a result of reading this paper, it sort of got me out there a bit. So having those opportunities, having publications and conference opportunities where emerging researchers can get a bit of a name for themselves. And it's not just about getting emerging researchers to come and sit in at a conference, it's actually giving them a bit of a platform to expose their journey, their learning to an audience and sort of, I guess, be inducted into the community a bit more. A really awesome opportunity that I had was the University of Melbourne have the Indigenous Postgraduate Summer School, and I credit that for getting me through my PhD. I did it in my final year, and it's a week-long residential camp for Indigenous people across the country who are doing postgrad studies. And I think it's convened by Ian Anderson and Marcia Langton, and that was just a really amazing opportunity to sit in the room with these people who you quote their work, and then to just sit and yarn with them and other Indigenous people who are having the same journey was amazing and really helpful. And lastly, empower. So I think the important thing we have to remember is that we need to support Indigenous people to do the research that we want to do. So I've been in a very privileged position. For the last few years I've been working at an Island Indigenous Health Service, and Noel has let me do the kind of research that I want to do. And that's, it's been a very privileged space that I've been able to occupy. So I'm involved in hip-hop festivals and all kinds of stuff that I believe in, and I've used my research expertise to build the stuff that I really feel strong about. My current position, I have quite a minimal teaching load to allow me to focus on writing and developing me as a researcher. So there's some infrastructural things that have been put in place to support me to develop as an emerging researcher. I think the most important thing, however, is looking at the whole journey is that we're not just trying to build Indigenous people who happen to be or accidentally are doing research. It really is about building Indigenous health researchers that do research in a way that acknowledges our way of knowing, being and doing. And so I think that needs to be part of that story, and it's not enough just to get a research grant and have a PhD scholarship attached to it where the project's predefined. How do we create opportunities for Indigenous researchers to have autonomy over the work they do so that they can do... We want to bring Indigenous perspectives to the research work that we're doing, and that can't happen unless we're open and have that flexibility to grow and empower our future researchers. So that's my story.
Good morning, Sago. First, I'd like to say, oh, it's right there. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor. And thank you for the welcoming. The land is beautiful. I wish I could see more. And I just want to put out there for now, I hope nobody took offense when I said singing and dancing. I was thinking more about back home. Our elders are quite harsh on those of us who don't know our language. So I wanted to start with that place because there's a very big difference in Canada, and one of them is the sense of inferiority, and that my mother and my grandmother spoke the language, spoke Mohawk, lived off the land, but they were beaten and it was illegal, and so they didn't pass it to us. And they did that so we could survive. And I think that now, getting a PhD, being a first generation, there's still a sense that we're inferior. We're still carrying that shame, or that we don't have everything, the PhD and all the cultural knowledge, because assimilation and colonialism really took that away. But as a first generation scholar, my job was to create that path and language programs so that my children would inherit that work. So they speak the language. They have those qualities of being able to go to universities and they're wired differently because it's so much more than the language. So I wanted just to start there in terms of, I think that the future and those people who possess both knowledges probably are going to have solutions and ideas that we won't have thought of when we've been raised only in the Western academic tradition. So I wanted to talk a little bit about mentoring. Do I do this or just go for it? So this is my grandson, Emerson, and one of the things that, he's the youngest of 5, that I find is the conversation needs to be from an Indigenous knowledge framework. You know, what is right about us? And what have we contributed to medicine? And I think that those conversations need to happen in our schools, in our communities, and we need to move away from the Indian problem discourse that the West has built up, because our children hear this and it impacts them. And I see it slowly as they go through university destroy their spirit and their soul in some way. So I think that we need to really reframe the conversation in order to facilitate a generation that solves these problems in a way that approaches it from our resiliency and what's great about our people, that we're still here today after all the attempts to make sure we weren't. So this is my daughter Makasha, and my foster child. I took her in 2 years ago now. Her mom passed, Shelby, and then my son, Cody. And just take a moment and look at their smiles. And this comes after my daughter Makasha sun danced for 4 days, fasting and dancing from sunup to sundown in 100-degree weather. And she's like incredible. She didn't complain, and she was annoyed with all the older women who were complaining. And she said, "You're here to sacrifice and suffer for your people." So such a different mindset. And she's on my mind right now because she's fasting in Akwesasne. She wanted to go to a program, which is one of the things that is a best practice. And the program, it was developed by a clan mother, and the clan mother worked at a health center and had the resources for some time, not anymore, to put together a 22-week program that young people get the teachings. It requires aunties, mothers, relatives, surrogates. Like right now, I'm not with her, which is really hard on me. But she has her aunties, and she has the midwife who delivered her, Gudji Cook, and other good, strong women talking to her right now as she's fasting. And but it's a 22-week program of teachings, and those teachings reconnect them to the land and to roles and responsibility. Now in health, you call that prevention and intervention. But they're talking to her about, becoming a doctor. They're doing way more than just, traditional teachings. They're instilling in them a sense of a dignity and self-esteem that we can't replicate. And honestly, Shelby, I haven't seen that smile, even though we were kind of suffering in the heat and whatnot since the last Sundance. So I know the connection between riding horses and ceremony and all of these things. That's where she found her mentors. That's where she connected to things that helped her. And I think that mentorship can be defined in different ways. Now, these are my daughter Amber's twins, Sophie and Isabel, and she's doing her PhD. She's got a year to go at U of T, and she went through immersion in Mohawk, so she couldn't read English at grade 6. And everybody told me I was destroying my child's future, and it was very hard to stick with the immersion program. And she's, obviously, we need to study that. We need to study the success or evaluate those who went through immersion, because from what I see, although I have no evidence, is they're doing quite well and they're amazing parents. People are talking about why we don't, why we drop out and, all of these things. And I think, it's pretty simple. I mean, we come from a legacy of boarding schools and torture, violated in every way. So one of the things, and why I'm standing here today, and I'm trying to keep in the 12 minutes, which everybody knows I can't, the incentive is how I went to high school and university was money. We were really poor, and I lived in the city, and at the time in the U.S., Carter had a program, and the program was if you went to school, if you were poor, poverty, but if you went to school, you could get a job, and I got a job at the psychiatric hospital. So it had to be a nonprofit hospitals and so forth. And I met with doctors and all kinds of people who were telling me, I was bright, which I had never heard that before. And they were the ones that wrote the letters so I could get into McMaster later. But money is needed, even in high school. So that was essentially the reason I'm here, that path of if you go to school, you can have a job, you can make good money. I don't know how we could rethink that in modern terms, but it worked for me. So again, I think what we've heard is the idea of, the identity, social cohesion, and self-esteem are all part of the barriers. So I think we need to start young and partner with universities to supply kids with role models. Whoops, that V isn't supposed to be there. Mixed with cultural achievements in medicine. I think that as a director for 12 years, and we have a lot of money right now to support students in school and to recruit, and I think that we could partner with these across the country. And I know Waterloo, Western, McMaster, I was doing it. We were getting these kids at 7 and 8 and introducing them. The native medical students took them around. And then we also did cultural, this is when Indigenous people contributed to medicine and all the, so they walked out of there walking on cloud 9. Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so I will skip this and just say that one of the other models we might want to look at is for mentorship is, as it was mentioned earlier, we have Indigenous ways of mentoring, and we need to look at that. And the Amazon Conservation Team has already been deemed a best practice. Now, they have a shaman's apprenticeship program, which we've been trying to get here, but we could also flip that and use it as, a health research program. So using a similar model, just changing the way in which it's done and funding actually both. Doctors out there shadow the traditional healers and they go into communities, and then Doctors Without Borders. These are exciting prospects. I won't have time to talk about our cultural exchange in the Amazon. But these are healthy children. And guess what? They're identified as poor. So the other suggestion I have is is, we need to build these relationships outside of university. In our traditional ways, we need to be able to, I've done unity rides, 2,000 miles on a horse. My time with a lot of those young people, they are now in universities and doing health research. So we need to be able to find ways to build capacity that's not just streamlined in a Western way. The Unity Ride, when I go on there, there's doctors, lawyers, there's all kinds of people, and we sit around the fire and encourage these kids that they're the future leaders, whether they want to do traditional or not. That's my eldest granddaughter, so she'll be the boss for the matriarch. Yeah, brilliant. So I think we need to look at our resilience and overcoming colonialism, and we need to find ways to look at language as helping these kids, because I see the kids that are in immersion get pushed to the side. And Amber had a really hard time, my daughter, because they thought that she didn't have the skills to go to university. So we have to do a lot of promotion in the communities. So I would just ask you to look at ACT, UMIAC, and ways in which other places are doing. Saddle Lake is another place that has a really good incorporation of Cree culture with sciences. I'm going there after I leave here, and IPAC is there, students are there, kids are there, elders, and it's a week-long camping event. And again, this is where you find your mentors, and I'm going there to actually mentor some young people. So try to get through that quickly, but there are, I say, grassroots mentorships that we need to look at, and we need to apply Western ways to replicate those through CIHR, because they have the funding, and none of these are funded through any agencies other than communities. So now